So 2 weeks ago, we did a kind of a long introduction to chapters 13 and 14. Together, chapters 13 and 14 are all about what the ESV calls leprous diseases, but as we've seen, has a much broader connotation than the modern sense of leprosy. Basically, imperfection on the surface of things, including people, houses, and clothing. And last week, we covered all of chapter 13, and tonight I'm almost certain I will cover all of chapter 14, completing that 2-chapter section on. I just would encourage you once again, if you have to miss a class or if you think that you wanted to go back and review or check out background material, it's always waiting for you on the internet. You can just go to the class website and easily find the class that you want to review. And now that I know that stuff is up there, I try to resist the temptation of reviewing too much every week, but sometimes, as you know, I fail. Normally, I begin classes with a kind of a long review and introduction and then cover the text sometimes rather quickly at the end. That is when we're studying Leviticus, because the text is redundant and difficult, and sometimes it seems to me the more important point is to understand the context and the meaning of it. But tonight, I'm going to do the procedure sort of backwards. I'm going to begin by looking right away at chapter 14, and then after we finish that, we can look back, if we have time at the end, and talk about how chapter 14 fits into the overall context of the Bible and Leviticus and the section of Leviticus that we're studying now. So if you'd open up your Bible to Leviticus chapter 14 and just sort of look there. And what you'll hopefully see right away, either if it's from the section headings in your Bible, or just kind of scanning the material that's in chapter 14, what you'll see is that all of chapter 14 has to do with cleaning, and that's the message I'm trying to get across with the picture that's up on the PowerPoint right now. Tonight, all of chapter 14 will be about cleaning things, but in a particular biblical sense of the meaning. Okay, it is all about taking things that are unclean and making them clean. In particular, chapter 14 has to do with laws that God has given for cleaning things, and even more specifically for cleaning people in verses 1 through 32 of chapter 14, and for cleaning houses in verses 33 through 53 of chapter 14, right? So all of chapter 14, except for the last 4 verses, which, as we've seen a couple times before, sort of summarize this whole 2-chapter section, almost all of chapter 14 has to do with cleaning. Now, I said I wouldn't do any background or review, but I'm going to break my promise just slightly, because I want to observe that all of chapter 14, which has to do with cleaning, is really a continuation of verses 47 through 59 of chapter 13, which was the last reading last week, so that as the Bible sits between verse 47 of chapter 13 to verse 53 of chapter 14 is one continuous big block of text, which all has to do with cleaning. All right? And please do notice that people are placed at the center of this discussion of cleaning. They're the things, people we are, that what holds all of this together. Garments are what people wear. Houses are what people live in. People are, people, right? And that's what God primarily cares about, and that's what the Bible exists for. The Bible exists to speak to God's people. And so we are, at the end of all of this, I think it's fair to say, talking about how people can be cleaned in a particular sense. But the related topics of garments and houses touched on here may help us to understand what God is doing and what the Bible is saying. So let me just remind you very quickly, we won't reread 47 through 59 of chapter 13, but let me just talk you through it quickly. Some of you weren't here last week either. The last section of chapter 13, verses 47 through 59, all has to do with cleaning clothing or garments, whichever word you prefer, things that people wear, which have somehow become infested with mold or with mildew or something like that, and how this clothing so affected is supposed to be treated by the people in Israel. And what we learned last week in our reading is if you have clothing that's affected in this way, that the first thing that you do is you go to the priest, and the priest will take the clothing that you've brought to him and he'll put it someplace and he'll shut it up for 7 days. They'll just set the clothing aside and wait for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest will examine the clothing, and if the contamination in the clothing has spread during that 1 week period, then the garment is declared unclean and it's burnt up in the fire. So that's the end of your garment. That's the end of your clothing. If it spreads during 7 days from the time you first showed it to the priest, it's gone. It's destroyed. All right. But if on the seventh day the priest looks at the clothing again and the contamination or disease, as ESV sometimes calls it, has not spread, it's the same as it was 7 days ago, then he'll take the garment and wash it, or he'll tell you to wash it, and then they'll shut it up again for another 7 days and wait and see what happens. And at the end of the second 7-day period, if the stain is still there, whether or not it's spread, if it's just the same as it was, whether it's on the front of the garment or on the back of the garment, then the garment is to be burned up by fire. So in this process, there are two chances that you have that your garment will just be destroyed by fire. One is if it spreads after the first 7 days. The other if it hasn't diminished at all after being washed and locked up for another 7 days. But if the stain has faded after being washed, then the stained area can be cut out of the garment, is what chapter 13 tells us. And if that contamination would ever appear again after the bad place had been cut out, then the whole garment would have to be burned up. So that's a third chance for your garment to be completely burned up. But if it never appears again, then you can wash the garment one last time and you can keep the remaining portion of the garment that hasn't, the part that wasn't diseased and cut out, you can keep it and it will be declared to be clean. And that was the so-called law for handling contaminated garments. And I want you to notice from this, the reason I review it, I want you to notice that the law is erring on the side of caution in protecting people. Because if a person's garment is unclean, then they would be unclean if they wore it. Anyone they touched would be unclean. I'm talking about ritual uncleanliness. All right? And all of this uncleanliness would break the relationship between God and his chosen people, because people who are ritually unclean cannot come to the tabernacle to offer sacrifices to God, to make atonement for the forgiveness of their sins, to have fellowship with God and the rest of the community. Uncleanness is kind of a serious business. And so the rules about how you evaluate a garment that may be unclean have a lot of chances to cause the garment to be destroyed by fire, to protect the people from the consequences of hanging on to something which is unclean. And surely that must be important to the economy in Israel and individual families. I mean, not all of these people were rich. At times in their history, most of them were poor. They might have only had the garments that they wore, very, very little in the way of spare clothing. And so they would have had a temptation to hang on to things, even if they were a little bit moldy or a little bit mildewy or a little bit spotted. But this law says, no, you can't do that. If the garment can't be saved, it's going to have to be destroyed. The symbolism here, I think, is theologically rich. For example, the kind of uncleanliness in view here and throughout chapters 11 through 15 is not equal to sin. Garments cannot sin. Garments that have mold or mildew are not being punished for their sin. They just have mold or mildew. It's an uncleanness that needs to be separated from Israel, because Israel is God's chosen people. But it's not a moral thing. It's just a worship practices thing. And so obeying these laws are obedience to God. Clothing is necessary to the life of the people, just like food is, right? And people don't want to throw away food. People don't want to throw away clothing. I already made this point, but if you notice, going all the way back to the beginning of this section with the rules about unclean food and so on, obeying these laws basically requires a cost of obedience. If you're going to obey these laws, sometimes you're going to you're going to not eat food. If you're going to obey these laws, sometimes you're going to not keep clothes. A demand is being made on you to be the children of Yahweh, because he's given you these rules and you have to follow them, and it costs you something to follow them, right? So being God's chosen people, being a holy people according to God's rules, carries a cost, right? And this is part of what makes them different than other nations. And this is something similar between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We don't follow these rules any longer. These rules have been set aside for us by Jesus. But still, in the same way, we're asked to do things which carry a cost if we want to belong to Christ, just as they were asked to do things which carried a cost if they were going to belong to Yahweh. Okay, so those some of those insights we picked up last week in chapter 13, yeah?
Well, just one sort of point of curiosity there, was the climate in Israel, I think now is kind of dry, isn't it? But maybe, for mold, it means that the climate hasn't been wet, I guess.
I'm no expert on the climate in Palestine, but I think some of the time it was wet, some of the time it was dry. And I don't think anybody who's read the Bible has thought it was weird that they were talking about mold and mildew in that climate in that time. But you can research that separately and report back to the group your findings next time. Okay.
Researcher here.
Okay, so now let me move back into the chapter I want to stick on. But I'm going to look at the end of chapter 14 before I look at the beginning of chapter 14. Remember, people are in the middle. Last week talked about cleaning garments. The end of chapter 14 talks about cleaning houses. And I have a picture up here to remind you what we're talking about. Verses 33 through 53 have to do with cleaning houses that have become contaminated. I prefer the word contaminated to infected in my modern sensibility, but mold or mildew or dry rot or something that can affect housing is what's in view here. And because we have not ever read this before, Steve, I'm going to ask you to read, if you will, Leviticus chapter 14, verses 33 through 53. And before you do, Ken, is his mic working okay?
You might want to project your voice.
Okay, what do you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, we'll begin.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When you come into the land of Canaan, which I gave you for a possession, and I put a case of leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession, then he who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, there seems to me to be some case of disease in my house. Then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priest goes to examine the disease, lest all that is in the house be declared unclean. And afterward the priest shall go in to see the house, and he shall examine the disease. And if the disease is in the walls of the house, with greenish or reddish spots, and if it appears to be deeper than the surface, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house and shut up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again on the 7th day and look. If the disease has spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take out the stones in which the disease and throw them into an unclean place outside the city. And he shall have the inside of the house scraped all around, and the plaster that they scrape off they shall pour out in an unclean place outside the city. Then they shall take other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and he shall take other plaster and plaster the house. If the disease breaks out again in the house, after he has taken out the stones and scraped the house and plastered it, then the priest shall go and look. And if the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house, it is unclean, and he shall break down the house, its stones and timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house while it is shut up shall be unclean until the evening, and whoever sleeps in the house shall wash his clothes, and whoever eats in the house shall wash his clothes. But if the priest comes and looks, and if the disease has not spread in the house after the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, for the disease is healed. And for the cleansing of the house he shall take 2 small birds with cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop, and shall kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water, and shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet yarn along with the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the bird that was killed and in the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. Thus he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the fresh water, and with the live bird, and with the cedar wood, and hyssop, and scarlet yarn. And he shall let the live bird go out of the city into the open country. So he shall make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the beginning of what Steve just read. In verse 33, please notice God is speaking now again to both Moses and to Aaron, which makes sense because this is a passage in which priests, of which Aaron is the chief, his sons being the other priests, play a kind of decisive role, as you heard Steve read, in deciding what's clean and what's unclean, and in proceeding with the process of cleansing the house. Verse 34 is interesting in that it's looking beyond their current situation to the time after they enter into Canaan, the promised land, which God will give them for a possession. Remember, Leviticus takes place in the time during the first month of the second year following the Exodus from Egypt, many years before they'll enter into the promised land. And so here a law is being given which doesn't apply seemingly to tents or their current nomadic circumstance, but applies to the time when they settle in Canaan. Also, very interestingly, in verse 34, God contemplates a time in the future when they've entered into land in Canaan, when God himself is the one who puts the case of leprous disease into their house. That's what he says. And this will be not strange to a Hebrew reader, because Hebrews understood that everything that happens in the universe happens because God makes it happen. And there is a certain sense in which they're absolutely right about that. In the sense, nothing can happen without God's permission or against God's will. All right? We make finer distinctions between what God allows to happen and what God causes to happen. And sometimes that's just arguing about words. The Hebrews understood God was almighty. He was the only and the absolute power, so that whatever happened was happening sort of because of God. And so God is saying the time is coming when you're going to Canaan, you're going to find out sometimes you have contamination in your house. I know that because I'm God. And then what are you going to do then? Okay. And in verse 35, he says, what you're going to do if you obey me is the owner of the home, the person whose economic well-being would be affected by this disease and who might be tempted to ignore it or to plaster it over or to cover it up, but not in Israel. If you think that your house has this kind of contamination in it, then the first thing that you're supposed to do, just like with clothing and other things we'll read about with people, is you go to the priest. One of the jobs of the priest is to read the words of Moses, interpret them, and apply them for the people in Israel so that they don't estrange themselves from their God and the laws that he's set forward. And naturally, I'm sort of embroidering on the side, but naturally homeowners will have a tendency not to want to obey this law or not to want to see contamination in their house, because as you'll see, it's going to be expensive if the priest shows up and tells them that they need to start renovating, right? So verse 36 says that the priest will go there, and he's going to command them, first of all, to empty their house of everything before he examines it. I think the right way to understand this is one of many evidences throughout this legislation where the law is being sensitive to the needs and the problems and the economic well-being of the people, because we're not talking about cleanness and uncleanness in a sense that's objectively, logically, philosophically true. We're talking about cleanness in the sense that the priest says it's clean or it's unclean. If the priest shows up and he says it's unclean, it's unclean. If he comes up and he says that it's clean, it's clean. If he comes to your house and all your stuff is still in there and he says your house is unclean, you might lose your house and all your stuff too. And so what the priest does here is he says, before I examine the walls and so forth in your house, get all your stuff out of there, because one of the outcomes here is he might declare that the house needs to be shut up and you won't have access to your stuff for a while, maybe forever. Okay. So what would be wrong here would be for the Jew to disobey the law that's being put forward, to avoid, destruction and so forth. And the priest, for his part, he's going to avoid unnecessary destruction by at least emptying out the house before they start talking about the main subject. Verse 37 says, so after the house is empty, the priest comes and he examines the house. And the process is very similar to what I read or reviewed for you by way of introduction to what happens with clothing. You go to the priest with contaminated clothing, you go to the priest with a contaminated house. What he does is very similar. It says if the walls are contaminated in a certain way, and the priest is the one who makes this determination based on the coloration and so forth, then the priest is going to shut up the house for 7 days and see what happens. Then verses 39, 40, 41, and 42, sort of I'll talk about them all together. Verses 39 through 42 say, on the seventh day, the priest is going to look, and if the contamination has spread, then the priest is going to tell them to remove the contaminated stones and the contaminated plaster and haul all the contaminated stuff outside the city. Notice it doesn't say camp. It's thinking that they're living in cities now, in the land of Canaan. So this is a law that looks far into the future, or was edited into its current position, depending on what you think. But it applies to some time in the future of Moses, certainly. They're going to take all the contaminated materials that they pull out of the house, just like on this picture here, and take it outside of the city to some place where you can dispose of unclean things, toxic waste dump, I guess you'd say, from their perspective. All right, and you're going to do that. In verses 43 through 45 say, but if after you've removed all the contaminated stuff that you took out of the house, contamination breaks out again, then you don't have any choice. You have to tear down the whole house and haul all the wreckage, all the remains of your house outside to the dump, outside of the city. So the law tries to help you save what you can by cleaning your house before the priest comes, by giving there be a period of time during which the house is examined, by which the disease stuff is taken out. And if you seem to have stopped the problem, then the law wants you to be able to restore your house and to have it. But the law is being very careful about making a mistake of allowing some contamination to remain in Israel, because that would be even worse than destroying your house, is the way I read this. So verses 46 through 47 say anybody who uses the house after it's repaired but before it's finally torn down, they would be unclean for a time, and they'd need to wash their clothes and so forth before they could personally become clean again, because an unclean house makes the occupants unclean, which is the point of why you don't want to have unclean houses for yourself or in Israel. But if the repaired house stays clean, all right, and this is just some picture I found on the internet of a freshly finished, interior, a nice clean house. If it stays clean, then the priest will say, this house is clean. In other words, the guy can keep his house. And this has got to be a very big deal. I mean, homeowners in any place in any time, basically a lot of your wealth is in your home, and I suppose in their time that would have been true for them if they had houses they really wanted to keep them, and it probably wouldn't have been easy for them to afford the renovations, much less to replace the whole house. But they're allowed to keep their house if it stays clean, just like a person who was successfully able to excise the spot from a garment is able to keep the garment which is finally clean. Right? And perhaps because having your house saved is so much more important economically, perhaps emotionally, spiritually, than having your garment saved. Maybe that's why, in this case, a ritual sacrifice is called for in verses 49 through 53, because following this cleansing, they don't just say it's clean, as in the case of a garment. They mark off its cleanness with a ritual sacrifice, which is described in verses 33 through 53. Sorry, in verses, 49 through 53, the last verses. So look again. You should be looking down now at verse 49, where it says, and for the cleansing of the house he shall take 2 small birds, and so forth. So the fact that the house is apparently free from contamination, the previous picture, is not what makes it clean. It's what makes it possible. The priest has to come and declare it clean in order for it to be ritually clean. And for the priest to declare it clean, in case of a house anyway, the laws that have been set forth by Moses for the cleansing of houses. So he just can't say it's clean. He has to perform this ritual according to the law. And this is the ritual in verses 49 through 53. And Steve read it, and it's interesting to me that even though the person's whole home is being saved here, that the sacrifice that you have to make to sort of officiate its cleansing is relatively small within the context of what we've been reading in Leviticus. Only 2 birds actually are what it's going to cost you to make the sacrifice. But then I was thinking, probably for most of these people, the cost of repairing the house was already substantial. So the cost of obeying God has already been paid in some sense by ripping out the stones and ripping out the plaster, replastering, being outside of your house for consecutive 7-day periods, and all of that is the price that you've paid to be a faithful Jew in Israel. Now, thank God, it's been a successful house cleansing, and so there's a kind of a nice little ceremony that goes on to sort of rededicate the house. The way that the birds are used here is unique. As Steve read, one of the birds is killed, and its blood is mixed with fresh water, or some translations say living water. It means it has to be water that comes from a flowing stream or something, not stagnant water. Fresh water is used. And the reason why you have to mix the blood of the bird with the fresh water is, I don't know if any of you ever went bird hunting, but birds don't have much blood. Just a few drops of blood will come out of a bird. And so if you're going to do the ceremony that follows, you need more volume. At least this is one practical consideration. So they're mixing the blood with the water to do the next steps. And they sprinkle the house with the water. And I noticed for the first time while Steve was reading, it says in verse 52 that the reason for sprinkling the house is to cleanse it. All right? And so in some sense, it's already clean of the spots, the mildew, the mold, the rot, or whatever. But it actually being ritually clean is happening now when the water and blood solution is sprinkled onto the house. And really interesting is what they're using to sprinkle this onto the house is the live bird, not the one that was killed, but the one that's still living, and hyssop, which is a kind of a weed like you can see up there on the right, and a piece of cedar wood. And most people think, a lot of the rabbis think, or pictures that you'll see on the internet, think that they took the live bird and the hyssop and sort of set him gently on because he's got to fly away in the end, sort of set him gently on the wood and then wrap the yellow twine around him. And then they dip that into the water and sprinkle on the house. Don't ask me in detail why. That was the way that was prescribed in order to do this. And it says that by that the house was clean. And then the live bird they take out and they let it go out of the city into the open country. And it says, so shall he make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. And that's it. This is the law for the cleansing of houses. Okay. So it says that the house is clean by the sprinkling. That's at least a declaration by the priest, a recognition that the house is ritually clean. And it says that atonement is made for it when the live bird is set free. And if you remember way back to the beginning of this class, we talked about the meaning of the word atonement. And atonement has a fairly broad possible range of meanings. One is propitiation, that is, God is angry at sin, and so somebody makes atonement, meaning takes God's wrath for sin. The other one is expiation, that is, God removes sin. All right? In one way or another, God graciously descends things. The Hebrew basically says descending. It had sin, now it has no sin. The verb that makes it go from sin to no sin is a sort of descending or atonement, as we say in English. So the symbol of the bird going away, people talk about, what does it mean? Does it mean that the sin that was there somehow flies away, which is the symbolism in chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement when the scapegoat runs out into the wilderness? It's similar to that. Or does the bird symbolize the freedom of the person who's finally, or of the house that's sort of finally set free from contamination, now able to be used again? And I just have to say that better Bible scholars than me or you or us, can't really settle on the definitive interpretation of what it means. It was definitely the ceremony that ended the cleansing of a house in Israel. It is very similar to what you see when the whole nation is cleansed each year on Yom Kippur, when the Day of Atonement, chapter 16. It's also very similar to what we'll see here in a minute when people are cleansed from their skin diseases too. And so the symbolism, whatever it is for the house, must be the same for people and for the nation. Or at least there's a resonance there that makes you really think about it. Okay, so far tonight we've examined laws for cleaning. I quickly reviewed last week's reading in verses 47 through 59 about cleaning garments. Steve just read the end of chapter 14, which talks about the cleaning of houses, which actually requires there to be a ritual ceremony at the end to mark a clean house. It's worth noticing that in case of garments and houses, the path from being unclean to being clean involves ripping out the unclean part. In the case of cloth, the only thing you can save is a fragment of the cloth, because you're going to be cutting out the spot before you're finished, and you're going to keep the rest. Right? In the case of the house, if it was unclean and later it's clean, you're going to be jerking out stones, scraping out plaster, restoning, replastering, checking and examining. The path from unclean to clean involves changing the thing, taking the bad part out. Okay. And if the removal process fails, then everything is destroyed. In the case of a garment, it's burned up by fire. In the case of the house, it's all torn down and taken outside the city and put into the toxic waste dump. Right? Now, God could have done something similar with people. And I personally think the structure of the text as it is here is actually saying to us somewhat silently, that's not what I did, right? The teaching on garments and the teaching on houses encloses the teaching on people. The subject is the same. How does surface anomalies, uncleanness, you can see, get cleaned actually and ceremonially. But clearly, people are being treated differently. When it came to garments and houses, the processes were being shaped to the benefit of people, to minimize the chance of what we call false positives, right? Of like saying that you're contaminated when you're really not. There was a lot of care in watching and repeating and looking, but also protecting the people from accidentally contaminating themselves, which would have been even worse, by whenever it was definitively proven something was unclean, just burning it up and destroying it and taking away. But people are not being treated that way, not here and not in the Bible. I think this has far-reaching significance if you'll ponder it for a while, and I've only just begun to. So we're supposed to notice that people are not treated by God as if they were garments or houses. Okay. To God, cleanness itself is not the issue. God is a spirit. Cleanness doesn't affect him in sort of a personal way. But what really matters to him, this is me saying this, but I think I'm right, is his people. He wants his people to be saved. He wants his people to be clean. He wants his people to be holy. He wants his people to live, eternally And so all of this is basically constructed until Christ will come to stand in for Christ as a means of reconciliation and atonement with God. And God takes it real seriously. And so the really big problem God has, if I could put it that way, is he can make rules for garments and houses, but what do you do about people? Which is what it cares about. Because in this world in which we live, people will themselves have conditions which invade their person. It won't just be their clothes. It won't just be their house. It won't just be what they ate. It won't be because they touched a dead body. It won't be because they went to the toilet, which is, and other things which come out of your body, which is next chapter 15. Sometimes the body of the people itself will be invaded by some growth which is not unnatural, but unclean. It's part of the universe we live in. In that sense, it's natural, bacteria and other kinds of contamination. But how do you think about that within a worship context when God's people have these kinds of skin lesions and stuff? That's what we're talking about. So last week, for those of you who are not here, and I'm just going to put the slide up from last week, we're not going to talk about it. But in verses 2 through 44 of chapter 13, the Bible carefully goes through 7 different cases, 7 different kinds of skin disease that the priests would examine and gave procedures whereby they would determine whether the person who came with such a condition was unclean or not, how would you prove whether it was clean or not, and so forth. And again, all of these procedures, if you read them, were written, if I am reading it right, by a God who really wanted to lean in the side of the benefit of the people. It really was a chance to avoid priests being too enthusiastic or mean-spirited or overreaching, to give a lot of clarity about what it was that made you unclean and conversely what it was that didn't. So you were really supposed to be careful not to falsely diagnose somebody as unclean because the penalty was severe. You were put outside of the community. But on the other hand, the community was in danger if you were really unclean and you stayed. And so when it was definitely clear that you were unclean, then the law acted fairly quickly. Right? It all reads sort of like that. And in no case, though, and this is something that just struck me today in preparing for this class, never was anything said about excising dead tissue. It never said you'll cut out the diseased tissue. It never said you'll amputate the arm that has a contamination, right? It never said actually anything about healing the person who had an unclean skin condition. And it never said anything about putting them to death. No matter how grotesque or how infected they were, it never said they shall be burned up by fire or they shall be killed and taken outside the city. Human life is fundamentally more valuable to God than anything else in his creation. And so there's a different set of rules for people physically. And I dare say this is giving us some spiritual suggestions about how God thinks about people spiritually and about our immortal souls also. God is really sort of bending over backwards to try to help us in our sins, starting in the Old Testament and continuing even more so into the New. The worst thing that could happen to people, and also the best thing if they were determined to be ritually unclean, is that they would be made to live outside the camp or outside the city later in the land of Canaan. And that would only be something they had to do for so long as their condition persisted. So what we read last week was really open to the possibility or the hope, mindful of the fact that people who suffered from unclean skin conditions might later become clean again, right? That was always thought about and hoped, I dare say. But there was no guarantee, and I think there was always the feeling as you read through the cases last week that some people that presented with a disease would be called unclean and they might remain outside the camp for the rest of their life or for a long time. And we saw examples like that in the New Testament with Jesus healing people who had been lepers for a long time. So anyway, in summary and in short to that, people with unclean spots are largely excluded from the life of the community, completely excluded from entering into holy places and touching holy things, therefore unable to offer sacrifices for the atonement for their sins or to express their loyalty to God or to have fellowship meals with other people in the community. They're just really separated from Israel, and Israel is the community of those who are saved at that point. I mean, that's God's people, and it's the physical on earth representation of sort of heaven. God is living there in a tent among them, right? This is the Old Testament reality of God is on board, and these people are on the edge of God's community because of this skin disease. Okay. And so, although in a humane way, these people are being treated better than clothing and better than houses it's pretty bad for these people who are excluded, right? And I don't know whether this may seem harsh, and it may seem like God is being harsh because the Hebrews understood everything that happens to be an act of God, and so they would have seen a person affected this way. They would have understood that God sort of caused that to happen, and they would have had a tendency to understand, God caused this to happen because of the sin of the person. That would have been a natural conclusion for them to have reached, probably. And it would have been reinforced by the probably 1 or 2 dozen cases there are in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, where we read that God dealt with a particular sinner by afflicting them with a grievous skin condition such as this. So there are cases like that in the Bible that would make you think, when you saw a person so affected and set off from the community as being unclean, that maybe this is some kind of punishment for their sin. But that equation is far from simple. Okay, you have to stop and really ask yourself, do we understand this right? The law does not say that. The law does not say the penalty for sin is an unclean skin disease. Neither does the law say everybody who has an unclean skin disease or any other condition that makes them unclean is sinful. It merely says that they're unclean. And all of that means is that they're separated from the community and the worship environment for a time. It happens if you eat the wrong food. It happens if you have a baby. It happens if you go to the toilet. It happens if you have sex. It happens if you have menstruation. It happens for lots of things that can make you for a time outside of the sort of worship environment, but never are those things called sin. Having a baby is certainly not sin. And so you can't say that having leprosy is certainly sin either. The Bible simply does not say that. Second of all, the book of Job is basically written to deny that proposition. Those of you who love the book of Job and have studied it, Job was afflicted by all kinds of things, including boils on his skin and all kinds of other things. And the whole business of Job is saying bad things happen to good people, and sometimes God is the only one who knows why, right? And so I think we have to be very, very careful about thinking that people affected with skin diseases, even those declared as unclean by Moses, are necessarily simply suffering for their sin. And we really have to be careful these days of saying, if you know people who have some sickness or disease or whatever, saying, that must be because of their sin, because it's not true. I mean, Jesus teaches that's not true. Okay, right? And finally, on the case of skin disease, Jesus himself was extremely solicitous of people suffering from leprosy. He went to the home of Simon the leper. Every time a leper showed up, he would heal them and their sins. And he was very open to these people, never treating them as if by any means they were the greatest sinners. In fact, Jesus treated as the greatest sinners the scribes and the Pharisees, who would have condemned these people from being sinners, right? So the Bible is very nuanced on this subject. Yes, everybody has sin. Yes, God could use a disease or something like this to teach you, to chastise you, to guide you, to reprove you. God can use anything to try to save us, including hardship, including disease. But there's no simple correlation between it, as you probably know without me saying so. Right. Finally, I just want to point out that under the Old Covenant, removal of sin was something that you did by going to the tabernacle and presenting an offering to God in atonement for your sin, except these guys were unable to go to the tabernacle to present an offering for the atonement of their sin because they were ritually unclean and therefore excluded. So they were really stuck in a bad place. I mean, the means of grace were seemingly separated from them by these rules. They had sin too, just like normal people, people with normal skin did, that required them to go to God and make sacrifice, but they couldn't, right? And so they must have felt, my sin is building up, my sin is building up, my sin is building up. Not only or even at all because of their skin condition, but because they couldn't worship God in the normal way. Like some people who are new Christians and love to live a lot of their life in church, and suddenly somebody tells you can't come to church, you'd feel terrible, right? You wouldn't know what to do on Sunday. They probably felt that way. So, when God removes such a problem from these people, that's a tremendous and multiform blessing. It's like for them moving from death to life. It's almost like resurrection for them in an Old Testament context, to have been for a time cut off from the people, cut off from the temple, cut off, they may think, although I don't think so, from God, and now feeling that they're able to come back into the presence of God and his people. And so we get then in Leviticus chapter 14, verses 1 through 32, what God taught to Moses regarding the offerings that were to be made on this wonderful, blessed day when a man or a woman who's declared unclean from a skin condition is healed and set free from their infirmity. It's a lot better than when your house is declared clean. And so, Steve, if you could read verses 1 through 32 of chapter 14, please.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then, if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood, and the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, and dip them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go into the open field. And he who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, and shave off all his hair, and bathe himself in water, and he shall be clean. And after that he may come into the camp, but live outside his tent 7 days. And on the 7th day he shall shave off all his hair from his head, his beard, and his eyebrows. He shall shave off all his hair, and then he shall wash his clothes, and bathe his body in water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish, and 1 ewe lamb a year old without blemish, and a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, and 1 log of oil. And the priest who cleanses him shall set the man who is to be cleansed and these things before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall take 1 of the male lambs and offer it for a guilt offering, along with the log of oil, and wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. And he shall kill the lamb in the place where they kill the sin offering and the burnt offering, in the place of the sanctuary. For the guilt offering, like the sin offering, belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the priest shall put it on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand, and dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, and sprinkle some oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And some of the oil that remains in his hand the priest shall put on the lobe of the right ear of him who is to be cleansed, and on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. And the rest of the oil that is in the priest's hand he shall put on the head of him who is to be cleansed. Then the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest shall offer the sin offering to make atonement for him who is to be cleansed from his uncleanness. And afterward he shall kill the burnt offering, and the priest shall offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the priest shall make atonement for him, and he shall be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford so much, then he shall take one male lamb.
Steve, why don't you take a break there? You just finished at 20, right?
Yes.
I did, but I was thinking I'm just watching the time, and maybe it'd be better to stop at 20. So let me discuss and thank you for reading. Let me discuss up to verse 20, right? So in the first 32 verses, part of which Steve just read of Leviticus chapter 14, we're going to learn what God taught Moses regarding the offerings that are to be made when a man or a woman who was declared unclean from a skin condition is healed and set free from that problem. Okay. Verse 1, if you look in verse 1, it's significant that God is speaking only to Moses here, not to Moses and Aaron. This tends to happen in Leviticus when there's a new sacrifice being defined, when God is telling Moses some new sacrifice. We saw through most of the first 7 chapters how God spoke to Moses, God spoke to Moses, God spoke to Moses. We started seeing God spoke to Moses and Aaron only after the priesthood was involved in actually checking houses or checking garments and so forth, where they were going to be essentially involved. But here we've got sort of new legislation coming to God from Moses. A new type of sacrifice is being defined, which is not the same as those that were defined previously in chapters 1 through 7. Okay. All of chapters 13 and 14, as I've been saying, are described as the law for leprous disease of every kind. The first 32 verses of chapter 14 here are described as the part of this larger law which applies to people, and it applies to people on the day of their cleansing. The first thing that happens, of course, is that they're thought to be clean, but they can't just say so. They have to bring the person to the priest. Right? But in verse 3, you can tell this can't happen by bringing the person to the priest at the tabernacle or anywhere near the holy place, because the person is still unclean and can't enter into the camp or into the city. And so the priest has to go outside of the camp in order to check on the person. So the priest goes outside the camp or outside the city to see if the person is really healed, as somebody says they are. And if the person really is healed, we read in verses 4 through 7, then the priest commands them, it says. We don't know who them is, but presumably it's the people who brought the news to the priest and brought the priest back to see the person, whether it's family or friends or somebody. And the priest commands these people to gather together all of the stuff that's needed for the initial ceremony. Right? And the stuff that's needed for this initial ceremony is the same as the stuff that was needed for the cleansing of a house, you may notice. The only difference between the cleansing of a house and the cleansing of the person in this first sacramental rite that's described here that Steve read is that instead of sprinkling the water blood solution on the house, you sprinkle it on the person. Otherwise, everything is the same. So whatever significance you attach to the freeing of the second bird when a house is cleaned, it seems likely to be the same significance you're supposed to see here for people, at least initially, when they're shown to be clean or declared to be clean by this sacrifice. All right. In verse 53, it was said that this ceremony made atonement for the house. It's reasonable to assume here that somehow this ceremony makes atonement for the person in approximately the same sense. All right. And so this is something you want to ponder, because houses can't sin. clothes can't sin and houses can't sin. And yet, in the case of your house, it was necessary to perform this ceremony to make atonement for your house, to cleanse your house. And so, what's happening here in the case of the person can't be acutely or precisely that they're being cleansed from their personal sin, as I was talking about earlier. It's not clearly the case that they're suffering from a skin disease because of their personal sin, as you might imagine, any more than your house was suffering from contamination because the stones sinned or the plaster sinned. The person's body is affected the same way the house stones and plaster were affected, but it's not necessarily sin in a simple sense, I think. Right? So maybe the bird set free represents the removal of the disease from the person and from the house. Or maybe the bird sets free represents freedom of the person who's being set free from the captivity of their disease. Right. And at the same time, we know that in this world, all the bad things and diseases and sicknesses and everything somehow can be traced back to the fall of man and the sin that's in the world because of sin. And so maybe the person is affected and the house is affected and the clothes are affected, all sort of for the collective sin of mankind in the world. And in that sense, there's a removal of sin by sending the bird free into the world. But anyway, it's not easy to be certain that we understand what's being symbolized here when this ceremony happens and finally the bird is set free. What does it represent for a person? What did it represent for a house? Okay. And I would say to you, ponder that, but at the very least, it's like Old Testament skywriting. It must be very emotional. This person has been exiled outside the camp. They've been clean. The ceremony is being conducted to sort of acknowledge their cleanness. A ceremony is performed, and here comes this bird flying out to freedom. People must look at that bird and think, wow, this person is free from the trouble that they had, free from whatever their affliction was, whether it was because of sin or some other thing. God knows. God has set them free. And so then after that happens and the bird flies and they're set free, the next thing we read in verse 8 is that the person is supposed to then wash himself and shave off all of his hair. This is a good picture, except that he's supposed to shave off his eyebrows also. So he's missing one step. But the guy is supposed to wash his clothes, wash his body, shave off all of his hair, head, beard, eyebrows, and probably other hair. All right, and then on the 8th day, he's ready to approach the Lord now with sacrifices. The whole time he was unclean, he's been unable to make sacrifices to the Lord. But now, praise God, he's able because he's clean and the priest has declared him clean. Now he's going to go catch up, if I could say it that way, on what he owes the Lord during his period of exclusion. And the fact that this happens on the 8th day is probably hugely significant. Remember, it's the 8th day following pregnancy when a boy is circumcised, entering into the community of Israel after he's born. It's the 8th day following giving birth to a boy that the mother becomes clean after having been unclean because of her pregnancy. The 8th day following the creation of the world is the first day of the first week following the first Sabbath. It's the first new week. In many ways, this thing that's happening here is like rebirth. It's like resurrection. It's like circumcision. It's a very weighty thing, that a person has been cut off from the community of God, the church of God, and now is readmitted into the church of God. I probably couldn't say enough to say how big of a deal it is. And it's like being born and being circumcised and being redeemed and everything all at once. And so he's now clean. The clean part is finished, but now he has to offer a certain sacrifice following his cleanness. So it says in verse 10, on the 8th day after he became clean, the person who became clean brings 3 lambs and really rather large quantities of flour and oil. These are prodigious quantities of flour and oil. Everybody knows this. Nobody knows why, but it's a lot more than any other sacrifice. And verse 11 says the priest now, because he can talk to the priest, he can walk up to the priest. He's in the presence of the Lord now, this this bald guy. He goes before the presence of the Lord with all of the things that are necessary. This is a hugely blessed event for the man. And then the priest in verses 12 and 13 says the priest takes one of the two male lambs and the oil, and he uses those to make a guilt offering, or some translations have reparation offering. We studied this. Usually a guilt offering or a reparation offering is made to compensate somebody who has been affected by our sin. Or sometimes it's made to compensate God for the effect of our disobedience on him of our sin. This is not a sin offering. This is the guilt offering, the reparation offering. And it raises the question, what is reparation being made for? And it's strange that the reparation offering pops up first and so prominently and at such length. And again, it's repeated in the case of a poor person almost word for word. This is reparation offering writ large by some reason here that's happening. And that's what happens with the first of the three sacrifices is a reparation offering. It's difficult to know exactly why a reparation offering is required. The best guess I read is that maybe reparation is required because while this person was cut off from Israel, they couldn't render service to God or to their fellow citizens. They couldn't make offerings. They couldn't do anything for the community. And so in some sense, a kind of passive sense, they owe something to the community and to God, and the reparation offering is for that, maybe. Or maybe the fact that there's sickness at all in Israel has to do with the collective failure of the people in Israel, because Israel as a nation is sinning all the time. It may be that different people are affected by bad things because of all of the sin that's in Israel generally. And so the reparation offering is a repayment to God for their disobedience as a community, which is just one evidence by this guy having been affected by disease. And one of the really interesting things in what Steve read about this guilt offering, which kicks it all off, first the blood and then the oil, which is part of this offering, are taken in turn and put on the ear and the thumb and the big toe on the right side. First the blood, then the oil. And the thing that you're probably supposed to notice is this is what happened when Aaron and his sons were ordained as priests in Israel. They went from being normal people in Israel to people marked specially by God to enter into the holy place. This guy, the bald guy from the shower, he's been outside of Israel. He's now clean and he's being marked by God specially to enter into the holy people. All right, and so everything is symbolizing that God is taking this person and making them into his holy child again by an adding up of symbolism, I think. So once all of this guilt or reparation offering and the anointing with the blood and the oil finishes, then in verses 19 through 20, the priest goes ahead and offers the other two animals in turn. First one as a sin offering and the next one as a burnt offering. The grain is included with the burnt offering, making it a pleasing aroma to God. And I think these are understood in the usual way. The guy is back now. He's been cleaned. He's made reparation for whatever it was he made reparation for that happened during his period of uncleanness. Now he's has free access to the tabernacle and to God. And so he begins his new life, his fresh, renewed life, with a sin offering and a burnt offering in pretty much the usual way that we've read about up until now in Leviticus. And once he's made these sacrifices, if I could say it this way, he's kind of at least momentarily all caught up with his sacrifices. He's square with God. He's clean. He's back in the community. He's back in the tabernacle. He's made all of his reparations, whatever they were for, and he's offered his sacrifices for his sin and a pleasing aroma to God for fellowship with God. Now this thing that we just described would have been a huge financial burden for some people, particularly people who have been cut off from the community because of their uncleanness for a long time. And so Steve didn't read this, but in verses 21 through 32 are made provisions for poor people who have just been returned to cleanness. And the only difference, I challenge you here to see if I'm wrong, the only difference between what Steve read for the rich people and the final passage, which is for the poor people, I can only find two differences. One is instead of 3 lambs, it's 1 lamb and 2 birds. They can be doves or they can be pigeons, and it doesn't matter what gender they are. And the other difference is 1/3 as much flour is required. Instead of 3/10 of an epoth or whatever they call it, it's 1/10. And so there's slightly less flour, and they traded out 2 of the lambs for 2 birds, but otherwise it's exactly the same ceremony. And the fact that it's exactly the same ceremony is significant because the point is rich people and poor people are entitled to the same process when it comes to cleansing and reentry into society. It also tells us that nothing about this is magical. It works just as well with 3 sheep as it does with with 1 lamb and 2 birds, or this much grain or that much grain. The details are not the important thing. What's important is obedience to God. Did you obey what God said to do in this case? Yes or no? And so a poor person can obey God, and a rich person can obey God. And there's just a slight difference in what it costs to do that because rich people can pay more than poor people can pay. So I had intended to say a little bit more tonight, but we've covered the text of chapter 14. If you understand what I said about the last verses, starting in verse 21 and going to verse 32, being exactly the same as what Steve read, except for the differences noted. Perhaps next time, in my introduction, next time I may, I wanted to tie this back into what we've been studying about clean and unclean food and pregnancy and all of that, because I'm really starting to see a pattern here I never saw before until we started studying Leviticus this time. I mean, God is causing there to be things you can do to obey him, to be part of his community. He's causing it to be an expensive kind of obedience in order to obey him. It's something that's available to everybody in Israel if they'll obey him. The objective is only to save them and to protect them from things that would cause them to be not saved. It's not nearly so random and strange as it first seems when you read Leviticus, I think. There's something here that we need to keep thinking about. But it's 10 minutes after 9, and therefore I will pray. Dear God, I apologize again for being a few minutes over time. Please forgive me. Please help everybody to get home safely tonight, despite leaving a little bit late. And for those people who decide to stay tonight for the small group fellowship, we ask you please to give them energy for that and to stay here with us a while longer tonight so that we can have fellowship with you. We ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.